diving into the really revolutionary concepts of Mycopunk architecture and this vision of scaffolded cities. Now, for those of us engaged in, design thinking or grappling with global political challenges, or frankly, just deeply interested in ecological innovation, these ideas represent a profound reevaluation of our built environment. We're talking about moving beyond conventional concrete and steel, envisioning structures that are, alive, adaptable, and fundamentally integrated with natural systems. This isn't just some new aesthetic. It's really a redefinition of how we build, how we live, and importantly, how we interact with the planet. So the central question before us today is, I think, pretty critical for anyone concerned with the future of urbanism. Does this new paradigm represent a radical epistemological shift, like a fundamental change in how we know and understand architecture and urban planning, demanding we maybe abandon or fundamentally dissolve traditional categories? Or is it a sophisticated evolutionary augmentation, a kind of dressing of existing archetypes that enhances and reconfigures our current frameworks, opening up expanded possibilities for both human and ecological flourishing?
I'll be arguing that Mycopunk architecture signifies a fundamental transformation, dissolving established binaries and, crucially, relocating human agency within a broader more-than-human system. And I'll contend that while yes, it's deeply transformative, this movement represents a powerful evolution and expansion of existing architectural archetypes, creating adaptive layers that augment our built environment rather than entirely replacing its foundational structures. It's more about updating our fundamental design language, not discarding it.
Okay, so from my perspective, Mycopunk architecture initiates nothing less than a profound phase transition for human civilization. We're moving beyond the static, inert urban forms we've known for centuries. I've started calling this liminal urbanism, a concept that deliberately blurs the distinctions we typically cling to, temporary versus permanent, or even where the support structure ends and the supported space begins. This isn't just about renovation. It's architecture emerging from its static chrysalis, as it were. Think about the rigid geometries of 20th century urbanism, those predictable grids, the unchanging towers, the clear separation of functions. Mycopunk dissolves these. We're witnessing a new material politics where the very substances we build with become active agents. For instance, compressed mycelium construction, using the root-like network of fungi, embodies what some call thing power.
This means the building material itself isn't passive. It's an active participant in urban evolution, growing, adapting, maybe even self-repairing. Imagine buildings that don't just stand there, but actively process inputs and outputs, blurring that traditional indoor-outdoor binary into subtle, continuous gradients. And crucially, green infrastructure isn't just decorative wallpaper. It's the core nervous system, turning buildings into, living organisms.
This suggests a planetary-scale transformation of human habitation, implying a fundamental shift away from human sovereignty over nature towards a collaborative relationship with material and environmental forces. For those of us in design and planning, this forces us to ask, what does control even mean when your building is a living, responsive entity? It pushes us towards, I think, greater humility and skillful collaboration with complex, living systems that, frankly, far exceed our full comprehension. This is a serious philosophical challenge to anthropocentric design. Right. While I absolutely acknowledge the transformative potential you've laid out, and it is fascinating, I approach this from a slightly different angle. Perhaps one more grounded in the, let's say, enduring patterns of human settlement. I see this emergent architecture not really as dismantling the core house archetype, that fundamental idea of shelter every child instinctively draws, but rather as intelligently dressing and evolving it. It's creating what I might call a framework of frameworks, expanding our understanding of space itself rather than discarding its foundational concepts. The scaffold here isn't just a temporary construction kit, it's a metastructure, an always-present, adaptable layer that reveals how we've always conceived of space.
Interesting.
Yeah, it becomes a kind of fourth skin for buildings, a living membrane that constantly mediates between our stable interior environments and the dynamic, sometimes chaotic exterior world. Think of building surfaces as diplomatic spaces, actively negotiating with natural forces like sunlight, wind, rain, maybe even hosting pollinator pathways or urban farming, as you mentioned. It certainly proposes multi-species architecture and post-anthropocentric design, absolutely, but critically, it does so without eradicating the fundamental human need for shelter, for privacy, for community. So this isn't about destroying the archetype. It's about making permanent the temporary scaffolding that always enabled creation and adaptation in human history. It allows structures to be multilingual, speaking the language of human habitation, yes, but also the languages of water flow, biodiversity, energy exchange. They become multifunctional, integrating ecological services and communal spaces that are strategically scaffolded onto existing urban substrates. This, to me, represents a profound cultural evolution, where the archetype kind of updates itself through collective practice. It offers crucial concepts like concentric privacy, the ability to retreat but also to engage, and nested sovereignty, empowering communities to address complex problems at multiple scales, from a single dwelling to an entire district, all within an adaptive system.
I appreciate your focus on the enduring house archetype and how you see these changes as dressing it. But to truly challenge that archetype, I think we have to confront something deeper, an epistemological shift, a fundamental change in how we know and understand our built world, blurring the very boundaries between the artificial and natural. This isn't just evolution. It feels more like a refoundational moment. Consider how mycelium-based approaches inherently compress technological diffusion timelines through the inherent scalability of biological systems themselves. That's a game changer. It radically shifts our perspective, suggesting we maybe abandon the pretense of teleological permanence, this whole idea that a city is built to be finished and static forever.
Right.
This is a vision of an infinite city, where urban growth maybe no longer consumes rural land in the same way, and buildings literally evolve new configurations in response to changing conditions, much like ecosystems do. The Mycopunk aesthetic itself, with its organic forms and responsive surfaces, embodies a collaborative approach that absolutely abandons the modernist fantasy of total control. It's a fundamental reorientation of human-environment interaction, I believe.
I'm definitely drawn to your point about an epistemological shift and the need to move beyond that teleological permanence. I completely agree that the static, finished city is, well, a fallacy. However, where I think we differ is in the degree of that transformation. I see this change as being about breaking the archetype prison of that fixed house that every child draws. Yes, but it achieves this through an evolution of the house archetype itself, not its complete obliteration. The architecture truly becomes bilingual or even multilingual, as I said, integrating human shelter with the languages of water flow, pollinator pathways, seasonal change. We are, in effect, making the temporary scaffolding permanent, acknowledging that buildings are never actually finished, but merely frozen at an arbitrary moment in their development.
So this isn't an obliteration of the existing urban fabric. It feels more like an add-on, a structural augmentation for the already existing cultural urban substrate. This idea will spread like a virus through the imagination, setting off chain reactions and positive feedback loops. It feels like a powerful cultural evolution, rather than a total conceptual overhaul that demands we discard our fundamental architectural lexicon. It's about adaptive layering, really.
Okay, this discussion about fundamental shifts versus evolutionary overlays brings us to a really critical philosophical question, particularly for those, in design thinking and social engineering. Who or what is actually in charge? When buildings respond dynamically and materials possess agency, like in these living mycelial structures, human intention must, negotiate with material properties, environmental forces, and community needs. Our traditional concept of human agency gets sort of relocated within larger networks of relationship. This isn't just a minor tweak. It demands new forms of wisdom and, frankly, humility. collaborating with forces that often exceed our comprehension and control. Imagine a building that subtly alters its form based on microclimates or even collective user data. Who makes the final call? This living architecture raises profound questions about ownership, responsibility, care, things that our legal and social frameworks seem entirely unprepared to address. We're talking about a fundamental shift in our perceived sovereignty over our environment, moving from top-down control to a more distributed co-authorship with the non-human world.
Vital question, but I'm not convinced that agency is lost or solely relocated into some abstract network. Rather, I see it as potentially amplified through collective human action within these new frameworks. While agency is certainly shared with natural processes, community assemblies become necessary governance mechanisms not just for social coordination, but for ongoing architectural evolution. This could create what you might call architectural democracy, meaning the ongoing collective authorship of spatial form.
Okay.
This manifests through scaffolded decision-making, creating nested sovereignty, where maybe small groups make decisions about local issues like facade gardening or shared space usage, all connected to larger networks of consensus. This system can potentially accommodate diverse personality types and life phases, offering that concentric privacy I mentioned, the choice to retreat to private dwellings, while also having accessible, vibrant shared spaces for urban campfires, providing a framework for communities to figure out how to adapt them to local conditions and collectively author their spaces. So it's about empowering collective human agency, making it more democratic and responsive.
This leads us directly to the challenging economic and social implications. The tyranny of the property line, as we know it, really begins to dissolve. These platforms, these scaffolded zones, are not quite private property in the traditional sense. They're more like commons, dynamically managed and shared. This system achieves multiplicative density, meaning the same spatial volume can support multiple programs simultaneously, maybe shifting throughout the day or week. Imagine a single structural component that generates energy, grows food, filters air, and hosts social gatherings. This moves way beyond mere accumulation in traditional density metrics, fostering zones of encounter between different ways of living. The economic dimensions of this challenge conventional metrics entirely, potentially creating wealth through regenerative rather than extractive processes, establishing real circular economic loops within the urban fabric itself. It feels like a fundamental reimagining of value, and maybe even a new psychological implication, where security becomes associated with adaptation and flow, not just static solidity.
I'm not convinced that the house archetype completely dissolves. Rather, its protective function maybe expands and adapts. We're adding layers of shared space, creating those vital urban campfires I spoke of earlier. The issue, I think, particularly for our ecologically minded audience, is about increasing the planet's living surface by activating currently underused or unused spaces like building setbacks, rooftops, parking lots, turning them over to community and ecological services.
The scaffolded zone generates value in new ways through food production, energy generation, carbon sequestration, water management, and critically, the idea is that this value gets shared among the community rather than extracted by distant investors, fostering multiple economic languages. You could see gift economies, market economies, and commons management coexisting. Value creation becomes tied to regenerative practices and environmental responsibility. So, it's an expansion of our economic imagination, yes, but one that arguably builds upon and layers over existing structures.
So we've explored whether this Mycopunk vision represents a radical dissolution of established architectural paradigms, or perhaps an ingenious evolution that augments existing structures. I think both perspectives underscore the profound transformation that seems to be underway in our built environments and certainly in our relationship with the natural world. I've emphasized the fundamental shift in agency, the dissolution of traditional binaries like artificial natural or temporary permanent, and the emergence of architecture as an active participant in urban evolution, potentially moving towards a planetary scale transformation. This feels like a new epoch, demanding a reevaluation of our most deeply held beliefs about the human place in the ecosystem, challenging us to embrace maybe new forms of humility and collaboration with living systems.
And while fully acknowledging this deep systemic change,
have highlighted the concept of dressing the archetype and building a framework of frameworks, integrating these new living systems as an add-on, if you will, that enriches and adapts our existing urban fabric. This achieved potentially through collective authorship and nested governance, allowing our fundamental needs for shelter to become platforms for multi-species flourishing and community resilience. It's an incredibly sophisticated upgrade, maybe, updating our human operating system for urban life in the 21st century and beyond.
What is certainly clear from our discussion today is that our understanding of architecture, urban planning, and human habitation is at a critical juncture. The material offers really compelling insights into both the revolutionary potential and perhaps the practical pathways for integrating these ideas into our future.
Indeed, and further exploration of how these concepts might reshape social structures, economic models, and even our philosophical grounding in this idea of the infinite city, well, that remains incredibly rich territory for collective intelligence, for continued design thinking, and definitely for those committed to being change makers in the built world.